It took 3 days of marching to get to the hills to the west of Wessex's capital. They had travelled slowly east, through stone structures and across the ancient, raised pathway. They had stopped at Ethandun and one of Odda's priests had given thankful prayers for Alfred's victory. They passed, slowly, the lee in which Osrith had slept for several nights, and she wondered whether the she-wolf still made her home in that sheltered overgrowth. Presumably, her cubs would be long gone. At the west gate, a few words from Miral got it open for them, and Odda and his entourage proceeded along the main street until they came to the kneeling cross at the very center of the city. A left turn got them to the palace. But he wouldn't be there long. That very day, Alfred was leaving to ride north, to a bear on the north bank of the Thames, and Odda was going with them. The reason for the Gilgast was that the arrival of the leader, not king, of Mercia was imminent. Betrothal of Alfred's daughter to an ealdorman of Mercia was to follow, so Alfred must return for this happy event. Osrith, meanwhile, with Elfrith, were to remain with the household guard under Steepa's command. Miral was to lead some of the king's men on this expedition and wouldn't be back for several days. He says Cookham, Elfrith confided, genially, to Osrith, but he wishes to view the land beyond Cookham, near where Watling Street begins. It is where the border of Daneland is. Daneland. It was the first time that Osrith had heard the name, and her mind conjured up a land north onwards filled only with Danes. Yet, her head knew that it wasn't true. Bibbenberg was still held by her uncle as far as she knew, and there was, of course, Alba. Don't be disheartened, Elfrith said, passing her the beginnings of the unloading of the wagon. The household guards here are good fellows, we are all right here. Little to guard compared to on the road. Osrith smiled, and picked up the baggage handling process. 88,888,888. It turned out that the excursion to Cookham by the king was taking longer than the fortnight that was originally planned. The progress from Aylesbury had not arrived yet either. As Odda's guards, Elfrith and Osrith were placed under the command of Steepa in the absence of Miral, and that meant early rising from the guardroom and parrying, lunging and blocking practice as the autumnal sun showed its rays. Both Hayard and Godwin, young boys of about 14, were given to Osrith and Elfrith to train with. Neither of them were much good, but both had enthusiasm which, with drilling, and Steepa, the huge head of Alfred's guard, gave them drilling, both had improved within a fortnight. In that fortnight, Osrith had learned the customs of Wessex, not only in the palace, such as mealtimes, which seemed to be different to, longer than, the Dunnottar Palace Day Palace, but also because the life within it revolved around the Roman Church. Not that the Irish Church was not Roman, she once had it explained to her by a novice, Elfgar, who she had struck up a conversation with in the stables one day. Rather, the Irish Church refused to adhere to the new doctrine that the Pope issued with Augustine's mission. Colmcille died in the same year as Augustine arrived, Elfgar said, in a jolly manner as he talked to Osrith through the stable window and watched her clean the harnesses. You might have thought those Pelagians might have seen that as a divine sign, yes? Osrith had been about to argue, but remembered that it was her own ancestors, King Oswy, who had decreed that it was to be the Roman Church, not the Irish for the Northumbrians. Elfgar, thinking her ignorant from her silence, left her to her tasks, and Osrith reflected with satisfaction on the anonymity that being a Lord's Guard was giving her. But if Osrith thought the mundane nature of her tasks was enough, she did not reckon on, a week before All Saints' Day, that the head guard would begin training for the shield wall. Because you will have to know how to fight properly, no matter whose lord you are, Steepa told them. He then called to his guards, asking all of them to step forward who had fought in a shield wall. Apart from a few younger ones, most stepped forward. And then Osrith stepped forward, too. It was clear Steepa was not expecting this, and he eyed Osrith with suspicion, trying to work out the joke being played. When he could not, and with all eyes on that morning's drill practice on him, he beckoned her forward. Stand, he commanded, as the guards watched on. In fact, several people watched on, including some of the kitchen servants, eyeing up Godwin and Hayard, their eyes drifting over to her. Now, go. Attack me as if you are part of the shield wall, you piece of Scots scum. Ignoring the fact that she would be saddened with other men at her left and right, shields before her, six is drawn, and that Steepa's own guards were examining the situation with fascinated amusement, Osrith fixed her eyes on the head guard. A look passed between the warriors as she stood there. A susurrus of whispers circulated around her. But Osrith didn't look round, not even when Hayard, who had appeared at Elfrith's shoulder, and shouted, "Gaelish filthy scum! Gaelish scum!" Screamed back Steepa, unimaginatively, in her face. But still Osrith did not move. And then she moved, her anger, bitterness, at being betrayed by her lord, her estrangement, loss of place, all consolidating into one bright, hard crystal of will, sharp and piercing, grabbing the spear out of Elfga's hand. "Why should I? Useless Cushite. You only have 100 men, and they fight like an Denatian." Osrith punctuated the most important part of her trash talk, in Gaelish. His men were like women, so an opposing enemy might think them a curse, and misstep. It was what Domhnall had done to Ivar, the classic year-mum, and he had managed to thrust his sword into the Danish hero's chest as the man made a mistake. She pointed the spear at his throat, the banked-up anger and fury and sadness on the very edge of bursting its reservoir. "Doot!" she screamed, rage primal in her mind, building her up to the point where there would be just her, and Steepa and nothing else. "Do Comsil. Do Alpin. Do you I kneel." "And you," Steepa joined in, but broke off as Osrith opened her mouth to curdle a scream in her throat, as the Gales did. Her attack caught Steepa by surprise and he stepped back. A fatal move. Has he really been in a shield wall, as the crush of his own side would have driven him on, and his opposition, Osrith in this case, would have had crucial seconds to land a fatal blow. Instead, the head guard parried his sword, expecting Osrith to stop. But the adrenaline from her insults and her yelling drove her on, and she dodged the sword. Osrith charged at Steepa, rage draining any fear she may have from her very being. Controlled anger, fixed and prescient was the thing, and Osrith was there, knowing her opponent was screaming back at her for the same reason. He was big, Osrith could be in no doubt about that, and while that gave him strength and might, the head of King Alfred's guard was likely to be less sprightly than a smaller man. But he was cunning and wise, for though he was so ordinarily stupid that he did not realize his nickname was a cruel joke at his expense, Steepa Snotner knew his enemy too, and had had many years to gauge how Osrith might fight. She went for his legs, which he moved away at the last minute, aiming a kick to her torso, which caught her off guard. Most of the energy did not transfer to her body, however, and Osrith managed to turn, jabbing her spear haft between his legs. It did not matter how big a man was. Going for his legs would always unsteady him, and Steepa, though he did not fall, had been unsteadied, and this gave Osrith enough time to take tagged seeks and jab it towards his calf. She missed, and Steepa wheeled around, knocking Osrith to the floor with the flat of his now exposed blade, and she skidded into the mud and dirt. She hung her head, breathing heavily, aware that her comrades and her students were watching her, Buet bending back almost to the hilt, which showed the blacksmith had done his job very well. Steepa was coming for her again, and she moved aside quickly, labored breathing indicating she had been exhausted by the fight. But Steepa was no fool, and knew she was feigning, which indeed Osrith had been, for when he made to put an arm down to his defeated enemy, Osrith drew out Buet, raking her across the man's stomach, goring a line across his weathered leather. He pushed her down, and stepped back, as Osrith panted. She could have gone on, would have gone on if this were a battle, and it was only Steepa's retreating feet that caused her to climb back to her own feet. Though the decision was knife-edge, Osrith could easily have feigned concession, then leapt on his legs again. Ultimately, though, Osrith knew it, Steepa knew it, that she had almost beaten him, and she stood boldly, so he realized that she had indeed stopped in her demonstrative attack. "SN, good," Steepa snorted, as Osrith strode over to Elfrith. "You, there, boys." Steepa pointed across to them. What did that warrior do well? Didn't give up? Kept going? Hayard bubbled in. His face had been the most animated in the battle. Osrith knew. He was keen to learn, but he needed to listen, or he would end up being keen to die. Yes, yes, Stipa agreed. Anything else? Charged at you, went for where you were vulnerable, Godwin put in. Yes. He also pretended to be defeated. The Danes know this as well, but in battle, it is hard to judge the pretenders. And there was that unholy screaming. This exclamation came from behind the group. Stipa looked over the heads of the warriors, easy when he was so tall, and dipped his head. My lady, he acknowledged. They turned. This was the first time Osrith would remember, in the years to come, that she had seen Ethelfled. She stood tall, and was only around a year younger than herself, Osrith knew. And beside her stood her father. King Alfred watched them, catching Osrith's eye for a moment before Osrith looked away. The king and his daughter had watched her fight? Could you explain to the warriors how this helps, my lady? It was a lot of deferential words in one sentence, Osrith realized, and as she looked in their direction again, she noticed her father nod his head briefly. Your man here, Ethelfled continued, catching Osrith's look with her own gaze, poised, practiced speaker that she was. And battle-wise. It was clear Ethelfled took an interest in warfare. That scream, it sent a chill down my spine. The chanting beforehand, a recitation. Osrith realized that Ethelfled was addressing her. No, my lady. My saint, my king, my kin. Your king? Osrith could feel the color drain from her face, as she watched Ethelfled glance over at her father. Clearly any king to be mentioned in Winchester was Alfred, the only king that mattered. Flansinner, High King of Irion, Osrith lied. It was as good a king as any. Erland, she clarified. And your people make that ... yelling? This time Osrith said nothing. Why was this unusual? It was what the dull Riotans, the people of Alba did in battle. She had always done it, the Uineals did it. Even the Danes did it. Did not the West Saxons embolden themselves with a battle cry? It was how I was trained, my lady, Osrith said, simply. And it was used to good effect. This time, the king spoke. Osrith looked across to Alfred, then bowed her head. Stipa was startled, just for a moment. This time, she realized, the king was addressing all of the warriors. Just for a moment, Alfred clarified, looking at Stipa, for Stipa has been a fighter for many years. Less experienced or prepared enemy would be fleeing the field, or at least be making fatal mistakes. And that's sometimes all you need, a loose stitch in a garment to make the whole of the enemy's army unravel. Do go on, Alfred added. The training continued, under the watchful eye of the King of Wessex and his daughter. Osrith was paired with Elfgar, and Stipa with Elfrith, to demonstrate the basic sword skills that they needed to master, until the king left, followed by Ethelfled and, Osrith noticed, a young boy, presumably the king's son, who had been shown the warriors in order to begin his warrior preparation. It was a good few hours, until just after the highest point of the sun, when Stipa called a halt. He had been called to the king, and the warriors had been told to go to the kitchens. Lord Odda's men, one of the pages called through, and they were given meat and ale. They would practice that afternoon too, and the days when Odda and the king were tog there at Winchester. Something caught her eye as she followed Elfgar across the palace grounds. Where she had been fighting Stipa, a jewel was in the dirt. It was the pearlized metal pin that she wore in her hair, given to her what seemed like a lifetime ago, but in fact, had been only a few months ago, by the Norseman Eirik Thorgilsson. Osrith stooped down for it, only to find her hand crushed by the boot of someone. Miral. He was back, then, from his excursion with the king? Do not repeat that display of savagery again, Gaelish scum. Miral spat the words at her as Osrith tried to move her hand, but his boot was crushing her bones. He bent to say more, but did not reckon on Osrith pulling out seeks with her left hand and thrusting it in the direction of his groin. Then, she shouldered at his legs, unsteadying Miral enough for him to move. Gaelish savage. He growled in her direction, but did not attack her back. You have brought yourself to the attention of King Alfred, he glowered, before stalking off towards the ramparts. Oh, she could follow him, Osrith thought, as pride glowed in her stomach at her vindication of her skill in the face of Miral's insults at her underdeveloped stature. Instead of following, to voice her gloating, Osrith grabbed at the pearl, and a handful of dirt with it, and followed the other warriors to the kitchens.